really excited to see so many familiar names and faces. I'm thrilled that you'd spend a little bit of time with me today. I'm excited to tell you about SBP's Recovery Acceleration Fund. It's what I believe is one of our best and brightest ideas. And I think inside it is the potential to do precisely what SBP's mission declares, which is shrink the time between disaster and recovery. It's different than what our work has looked like in the past. It's highly innovative and I think fits with a sort of marketplace activity for investments of this type. And it's pointed and serves directly the populations and communities that we care the most about. So I'm excited to share a little bit more about it today. I will tell you that presently, when I'm not doing this via Lunch and Learn, I've been pitching it to a ton of investors. And so I may slip into levels of detail here and there that aren't totally necessary. I'll try to keep this at a high enough level that it's accessible and processable by everyone. I'd ask that you hold your questions to the end. As I mentioned before, there'll definitely be ample time for questions, unless, of course, your question is, where can you get an SBP vest like this? And the answer is when you pry it from my cold, dead fingers. All right, let's get started. Steve, do you have them up? I can't see them. There they are. All right, so the Recovery Acceleration Fund, let's get into it. Steve, could you go to the next slide? I'd start at a very high level, talking about SBP's Advocate Intervention, which is really about four main prongs. We want to do more resilient building. Our build team's doing that now. We're looking for ways to, from resilient tax credits to other initiatives to get stronger building codes implemented and to build things that withstand more frequent and severe disasters that we're seeing all across our country. As we know from our work, the moment where clients first start to access FEMA assistance is a crucial one. When clients get that right, they receive a lot of or nearly all the assistance they need in order to begin their recovery. And when they get that wrong, they receive little to none of the assistance they need in order to get started. And so we think it's crucial that we get the FEMA transaction absolutely right. We know that assistance can be streamlined and that currently disaster survivors are put through undue difficulty by having to fill out the same information over and over and over across a whole bunch of different applications. By creating a sort of layer of abstraction, we believe the federal government can create a single application for disaster assistance, sort of like the federal application for financial aid, the FAFSA, right? You fill out one set of paperwork and you learn all at once what resources might be available to you to help with your education. We believe the same is possible and even more urgent for disaster survivors. Finally, there's the Recovery Acceleration Fund, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today, but it aims directly at the amount of time it takes for us to deliver taxpayer assistance, congressionally appropriated funds to disaster impacted communities and what opportunity exists there to access private and social impact investment to reduce that time. Steve, if you want to go to the next one. So this is how federal funds flow at a really high level. And let me take a step back and just say, kind of how it happens is great big disaster happens, Hurricane Ida makes landfall. The state quickly assesses its ability to respond appropriately to the disaster and determines that it can't. Its capacity or resources will be overwhelmed and they request a presidential disaster declaration. Presidential disaster declarations happen pretty often. Not every community that receives a presidential disaster declaration goes on to receive a CDBG-DR allocation, which is taxpayer provided assistance that's appropriated by Congress and then divvied up and allocated by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So not every community that gets a federally declared disaster goes on to receive a CDBG-DR grant, but a lot of them do. And the way that works, or the reason it's so important, is because CDBG-DR assistance remains by far the largest amount of assistance that's available to communities and states to recover from major natural disasters. And it is the primary resource that would serve low and moderate income households in terms of long-term housing recovery rehabilitation assistance. The difficulty with it is that it takes about 8 years to fully flow through. As an example, Hurricane Laura happened in the fall of 2020. Congress only took action in the fall of 2021. HUD finally released the Federal Register regarding the Laura allocation in January of 2022. And the state of Louisiana believes it'll have a grant agreement in place sometime later this summer or in early fall. So it'll be till the fall of 2022, 2 full years before the state of Louisiana even receives federal monies and begins to implement its program serving citizens who are affected by Laura in the fall of 2020, right? And this is Louisiana. That's a best case scenario. Louisiana is impacted by disasters constantly, and state government officials who run these programs are as sophisticated operators as anybody in the country. So even in a best case scenario, it's taken a couple of years. In a worst case scenario, you can look to places like Houston and New Jersey and a couple other places in Texas, and you can see that the recovery takes a very, very, very long time for money to flow from Congress to HUD, from HUD to the state governments, and then for the state governments themselves to begin implementing those programs. And if you've heard me and JR present elsewhere, you'll know that around the country, the implementation of those programs is kind of a mixed bag. We think that by sort of making RAF consistent and replicating it throughout the country, we offer yet another way to raise the bar of performance for those programs, another way for them to serve eligible survivors more efficiently. If you want to go to the next slide. So what happens in those 2 to 8 years? You all work at SBP, so you don't need me to harp on this, right? Folks who can make repairs out of pocket do it. People who can afford to sell their home and leave often do. People who can't afford to make those repairs are forced to wait on assistance that they know is coming to them because they see Congress taking action and they hear state government leaders say the assistance is coming, but it hasn't arrived. In the meantime, the homes sit in disrepair, they become more expensive to fix, and homeowners themselves have to make difficult decisions about what they're going to do in the intervening period. Continue to try and keep up with the rent and mortgage and tax bills at the same time? Are they going to let the home fall further into disrepair? Can they afford to take out a loan and make repairs? Often they can't. By allowing homes to fall further into disrepair and not serving applicants more quickly, it also costs state governments more. It's more difficult to launch and administer large-scale construction programs than it is to simply reimburse repair expenses, which is what we're going to talk about a little more today. You can go to the next slide. So when the funds arrive from HUD to a state government, this is sort of bureaucrats speak for how they're allowed to spend the money. The CDBG-DR approved methods of distribution. So HUD reviews the state's action plan, and in its action plan, the state describes how it's going to spend the money, how it will distribute or take this money and distribute either dollars or assistance equivalent to survivors who are eligible to receive it. There are 3 primary ways that housing repairs get done in CDBG-DR programs. We've listed them here. First is the state can manage a construction repair program where it assesses the unmet repair needs for survivors and directly manages contractors. The state can do it a second way where they assess the unmet repair need and then they provide the homeowner with a grant who will then go and hire their own qualified contractor. Or the state can reimburse the cost of repairs that were already completed. That's really what we're talking about with the Recovery Acceleration Fund. And there's been a bit of a problem with that third method, what we call the reimbursement pathway. You want to go to the next slide, Steve? So the reimbursement pathway, this is, it's HUD approved, and it allows state and local governments who are administering CDBG-DR funds to reimburse qualified survivors for some or all of their eligible home repair expenses. The problem with it is that so far it's only been implemented in a way that will allow for the reimbursement of expenses that people could fund out of pocket. So it's not for those who go take a loan to make repairs and get reimbursed later. It's only for those who have liquidity in the first place, savings, or they could access some family resources in order to make the repairs and then hold the receipts and submit them to the reimbursement program later. Those who are unable to make the out-of-pocket repair expenses or who aren't bankable for an SBA loan, they're not able to avail themselves of such a reimbursement pathway. And so what SBP is imagining here is pooling social impact and charitable investment to create the potential for low-income homeowners to borrow from that fund, make repairs to their homes, and then submit for reimbursement later, just the way affluent families do now, but using social impact investment capital to do so. This is how it would look visually. So this top row is how it currently works for families who can self-finance repairs, right? They apply to FEMA, they receive some assistance, they use their savings, they conduct repairs, the repairs are complete, they move home. Then when the state program is up and running later, they submit their reimbursements for receipt. If you don't have means right now, the second row is what it looks like. You don't have any resources, you apply to FEMA and you receive a little, you do maybe some limited repairs or maybe you replace lost property, and then you have to wait on the state government to receive federal assistance and launch a program that can send a construction company out to your home and repair your house. And so you don't get to move home until the state government is able to operationalize that program. The third row is how we imagine it working with RAF. So a homeowner who doesn't have any personal means, they apply to FEMA, they receive what they receive, then they'll apply to SBP. The way RAF works is we know right now, today, who HUD is going to prioritize for the assistance it's delivering to Louisiana. It's just a matter of time for the dollars to get there and the state to codify its process. But if we know today who's going to be eligible for that assistance, and if we know how the state's going to prioritize the service of eligible applicants, then we can go lend to the most eligible people by the lights of the state. And as soon as the state government receives its funds, it can start reimbursing these loans that SBP's made, and thereby making quicker progress toward its global grant goals with HUD, right? They're reimbursing the highest priority applicants for repairs that have already happened. And so they're that much further towards success. This is roughly, actually, could you go back one, Steve? The reason they glow in yellow is because, I talk often, those of you who know me or, tuned into some of my briefings before, I live close to the government advisory work. And so I tend to talk about processes and agencies, and I move back and forth through these things with ease. I often don't take enough time to talk about the why and why it is SBP really does this. And the glowing yellow houses are it. The difference in a family moving back into the affordable home they already own 6 months to 1 year after a disaster versus a family who has to swim through murky water, unsure where they're going to live or for how long, or whether they'll be able to afford this for 2, 4, 8 years. It takes a kind of toll that's difficult to explain, even if I spent all 30 or 45 minutes of this call trying to explain it. And so if you take nothing away, if nothing else away from this slide, take away, imagine what it would be like if you thought you might have to couch surf for 6 years. Imagine if you were in your 60s when you found that out, or imagine you were in your 40s and you had 2 young children and a spouse that you were going to bring along on that couch surfing trip. The impact that we can provide to individual families here it can't be overstated. That we figured out a way to do it while also generating modest returns for bold investors who want to make this kind of impact possible in the world. I think it's really incredible, and I'm just so excited about this program. I wanted to take a moment to highlight that part, the real human impact. You could go to the next one, Steve. So how does it work? The low-income homeowner will apply to RAF through SBP. A program administrator, that'll be SBP in this instance, will determine the survivor's eligibility for CDBG-DR assistance. So we have the state's program policies and procedures. We know who their highest priority applicants are. We know what documentation standards they're going to require and accept to verify client eligibility and prioritization. So we'll collect all of that, and then we'll go out and conduct a damage inspection of the home to document its existing conditions. Doing that inspection, we'll use Xactimate, the exact same version that the state of Louisiana is going to use to determine the rate of reimbursement for the repairs that SBP makes. So we'll use the same system that the state of Louisiana is going to use, and we'll estimate the repairs. We'll use the Xactimate to determine the final loan amount. We'll then use the loan proceeds to help the client hire a qualified construction contractor, which SBP will maintain a pool of pre-qualified general and subcontractors who are capable of performing these repairs. We'll help oversee the firms as those repairs are conducted, and SBP and the homeowner will pay progress installment payments to the contractors, likely not the 30-30-30-10 structure here, but a structure that we'll agree on with contractors as we finalize those details. Before each payment, we'll do another round of documentation of work on the home so that we have very clear documentation standards that fit with what the state of Louisiana is going to require for reimbursement. Ultimately, we will obtain a final building inspection and certificate of occupancy, and the homeowner will move back into their house. We and the homeowner will then hold their account, all of their receipts and reimbursement documentation. And as soon as the state of Louisiana is ready to begin its reimbursement program, they have agreed to prioritize the reimbursement of SBP's RAF loans. And so it's functionally taking private investor dollars and turning it into, it's allowing numbers to be read on a balance sheet that'll turn black in a couple of years, instead of asking families to live in a tent in their front yard while their state or local government figures out a long-term construction program. So we're pretty excited about it. We think it's pretty cool. And that's a quick rundown on how it works. Do you want to go to the next one, Steve? I won't commit the cardinal sin of reading the slide here. I'll just give you a second to do it. The benefits are numerous. And I think the potential market appetite and interest in this is pretty incredible. The way I keep imagining it is, imagine an insurance company that takes some portion of its profits and invests in an environmental, social governance way that allows additional investment in the Recovery Acceleration Fund. I see Deb's on the call, so she'll love this. An insurance company can take its profits and invest some of it in an ESG investment like the Recovery Acceleration Fund, where it will earn more money by repairing homes in neighborhoods that couldn't afford its insurance products to begin with. It's a tremendous way for an insurance company to show how much it cares about a community, not only its policyholders, but all of the community in the communities where it writes insurance. What an incredible way to make additional money helping people who had not yet been able to afford important insurance products that they need in order to protect themselves and their families against the worst that disaster often visits on them. So the benefits of RAF are great, and the potential for its scale around the country, I think, is large. Most of the feedback we've received on investments so far has been, can you make it any bigger? A $10 million pilot is interesting, but a $50 or $100 million fund that could be called on and operated in many states is even more interesting, particularly to the insurance sector investors we've spoken with. They love it in Louisiana. Governor Edwards sees it as an opportunity to prioritize the most vulnerable. He sees it as a way to more quickly achieve the state's recovery goals by reimbursing work that's already been done. And he sees it as an important way to show signs of progress in communities faster than the state government's going to be able to mount a large construction program and actually begin delivering repairs. So Governor Edwards is all for it. I think he also believes that there's good legacy here for him and for the state of Louisiana. I mentioned earlier the leadership role that they play naturally by receiving so many hurricane landfalls. I think here the state of Louisiana has an important leadership role to play in proving up how RAF can work and should work in communities all across the country. Go to the next slide, Steve. This is a little ticky-tacky. So the way the CDBG-DR grant works is it's an application-based system, and state governments have to write their own plans. HUD can't make them do anything. So state governors and decision makers who oversee disaster recovery agencies at the various state levels have to make active decisions, right? They have to include reimbursement as a method of distribution. They'll need to request a waiver on HUD's 1-year limitation for mathematical concerns that I can break down and explain if people are truly interested in it. But HUD grants this extension constantly. It's just a matter of request. And then state governments need to quickly publish the policies and procedures they're going to use to conduct reimbursement. That allows investors and operators to develop systems and programs like Keith and I and others have for the Recovery Acceleration Fund in Southwest Louisiana. Using clear, published, documented standards from the state government makes it objective and fair and really allows anybody to get involved. But the sooner the state government does that, the sooner lenders can identify the appropriate underwriting criteria for clients. With these conditions in place, RAF can happen just about anywhere. We're trying to advocate the necessary conditions for RAF because we know the more places it happens, the more quickly we can bring it to scale. And I'll say, we're out there now on a bit of a roadshow, fundraising tour, but we're also looking for strategic partners who understand the importance of replicating it elsewhere and who can help us access the appropriate decision makers in the many markets that now will receive HUD money in the next 6 to 8 months. We want to make sure that they're aware of the opportunity of RAF and understand the predicate conditions that they need to include in their action plans in order for RAF to proliferate in their community. The reason I'm so excited about it, look, it's a $10 million rollout for Southwest Louisiana. The good news in Louisiana is they're not going to write a different action plan for Hurricane Ida. They're just going to add the Ida impacted geographies and money into the same methods of distribution. So in addition to Southwest Louisiana, we'll also be able to lend and make repairs in Southeast Louisiana. And I think that's important consideration because Southeast Louisiana is a more densely populated part of the state, the area that was affected by Ida, and more of the damage is in the minor to moderate range. So there are more people with more houses in more like the lending profile of a potential RAF client. And so we say 10 million, but that was with only Southwest Louisiana in mind. The state of Louisiana just received 1.2 billion around Hurricane Ida. And so it's easy to imagine this being a 50 or 80 or $100 million fund. To the extent that we could get predicate conditions to exist in other states, a $100 million fund is not difficult to imagine at all. And I believe there's appetite to do it. What I'm most excited about, folks, is I said it at the beginning and I'll say it again here at the end. Right now, the way disaster recovery works for poor people in America is a disaster happens. We know that we know the low-lying vulnerable community was most severely affected. We give to the Red Cross. Congress eventually takes some action. We hope money starts flowing. The poorest among us are asked to wait the longest on the paltriest amounts of assistance that come with the least predictability that you can imagine. The Recovery Acceleration Fund flips that upside down, and it takes available social impact investment capital that's on the sidelines right now. It's simply not involved in disaster recovery in any way. And it makes those monies available to rebuild for our most vulnerable friends and neighbors, most of whom need exactly these kinds of repairs and are in communities where most states or local governments would welcome an opportunity to make these repairs sooner, serve these clients faster, reduce the total amount of time and cost it takes to deliver it. So I'm excited, not because SBP's got a new thing here. I'm excited because I think if this thing is brought to the market correctly, it won't be SBP's thing for very long, but it might be the thing that could invert the way recovery works in America for our poorest friends and neighbors. It might put them on top and take social impact money to serve them first, instead of leaving them on bottom and waiting, hoping, wishing that our government will get itself together and deliver predictable assistance to the people who need it most. And that's what I think RAF can do. So with that, I realize I've taken 24 of the minutes. We started at 3 after. Let me pause there and see what questions there are. And I know there are some coming in the chat. Kyle, I don't know if you want to moderate them or if you want me to just start at the top.
Sorry for the delay. I am happy to moderate. We've got a lot of questions. All right, so first question, Reese, is, and I apologize that, oh no, I'm sorry, never mind. Thursday brain. Do you think this program will have measurable impact on the housing market for homeowners that have been forced to move into rental properties and continue to receive rental assistance from FEMA while they work to repair their homes?
Great question, Alicia. My hope is that it's going to get some people out of temporary rental properties, right, and back into their homes. So many of SBP's clients became SBP's clients after paying rent and mortgage for years, wondering whether FEMA was going to renew their temporary living assistance at the 11th hour over and over again. We know that even when you're getting temporary rental assistance, it often won't cover all of your rent. It surely doesn't cover all of your living expenses. And you're still paying taxes on the properties that you own. So our hope is that there will be an impact to families who are in short-term or even medium long-term rental properties, in so much as they won't have to be in them. They can more quickly move back into their houses. The impact in this first rollout, 300 families in Southwest Louisiana, it's maybe not material enough to show up, but at scale and in lots of communities, I think there'd be good measurable impact.
Great. Thank you. Evan asks, according to what standard will the SBP RAF administrator guide the repairs on eligible homes, for example, to livable conditions or pre-storm conditions or with improved mitigation measures, et cetera? What limitations are there on the construction that can be done?
Great question, Evan. The standards are going to be so there's a housing quality standard, which is a HUD HQS standard, but then the state of Louisiana is also going to publish the construction conditions and standards that need to be met. So there's a pretty clearly provided state guide to what the standard of construction is. It's pre-storm condition, but to your question on improved mitigation measures, the latest HUD allocation, a real 130-page wonder that came out in January, encouraged, in fact, required all of HUD, all the CDBG-DR recipients of future notices or future allocations to spend as much as 15% of the total amount on future mitigation measures. It remains to be seen how the state of Louisiana is interpreting that. If they want to take 15% of the total grant and apply it to infrastructure projects that protect properties. But I believe there's a strong argument to make that if you can add meaningful resilience measures at less than 15% of the total reasonable cost for the property, you should be able to make those investments and make the structure harder. That, Evan, would allow us to do more of the retrofit fortified stuff. It would not be within scope of the initial repair, but if we could do it for less than a 15% bump in the total price, I think there's a strong argument to be made that that kind of individual household resilience is exactly what a market like Louisiana is going to need, and that will do far more to protect people than educational campaigns or seawalls.
Great, thank you. Deb from Farmers, thank you for joining. She asks, will this include households impacted by disaster in rural communities?
Great question, Deb. It definitely will. I keep saying, the New Orleans and IDA impacted region and Lake Charles just as kind of proxies, the major metro areas. But the answer is that it'll apply really in any city or county where or that was part of the most impacted and distressed areas that HUD names in the allocation. It's likely from an operational sense, Deb, that we'll begin in a highly concentrated area just to try and benefit from the many economies of doing lots of construction projects near one another, so we don't lose too much highway time between projects, this, that, and the other. But the potential for this to work in rural communities, it totally exists. Anywhere a state government or jurisdictional authority would be providing DR assistance, it could work there.
Great, thank you. Phil asks, what are the typical terms of the loan to the RAF borrower?
Great question, Phil. Keith will share with you some additional, you're going to ask technical questions because you're an affordable housing guy. And so Keith will share with you the pro forma and some of the assumptions, but it's, I think the way we wrote the promissory note or the way they wrote it, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's a 2 or a 3 year balloon payment, but we imagine that we'll receive reimbursement from the state government within 12 months. I forget what the interest expense is. Investors expect a return on investment around 4%.
That's correct. Everything you said is correct. So,
Thanks.
and to that point, I think predictability is important, guys, right? So, there may be while we expect that the funding would be paid back in 12 months, and the term might be, while there's a balloon payment in 2 years, there will be extensions. And so really, I think you hit on it, Reese, but really what makes this a really important feature, and that we're gonna leverage a third party to originate the loans, is there has to be that arm's length transaction. Otherwise, there is the consideration that is a duplication of benefits. And then further, what we don't want to happen is, for whatever reason, the case takes far longer than we've expected. We don't want to lose that opportunity to extend it. So there will be at least 2, maybe 3 one-year extensions that will allow us to see it through for, various issues that might materialize.
Awesome. Dulcie, I see your question. Does the state reimbursement program have a cap? It doesn't, but there's a kind of functional cap on how RAF can work. So I didn't mention this in the slides, but it's intended for single family homes that are not in the floodway, that are not substantially damaged, and so won't require elevation. And so in there's a sort of functional limit that applies to 50% of the pre-storm tax value of the home. And in that way, we'll have to select homes that won't require more than 50% of their pre-storm value in order to make repairs. And so that in and of itself will put a cap in. We're imagining about $30,000 in repairs per property. Keith, do you want to take Laura Grantham's question? Who will be responsible for paying the interest, and what will determine the interest rates?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, happy to take that, and great question, Laura. So the interest rate will be fixed. The interest rate is based off of really investor interest, right? So there's nothing that's guiding us right now to say exactly what the interest rate could be, but what we believe, and it continues to, I guess, as the interest rate market is in kind of fluxes today, a 4% is still a pretty good return. We'll keep it at that until it tells us otherwise. In terms of who pays the interest expense, that's a really great question, because right now interest expense on a loan is not a reimbursable expense. So this goes back to, well, how are you going to cover that interest expense? And so there's a couple of ways to think about it. First, there is the first loan loss and or funding of the pot is going to be the philanthropic dollars. So we're going to go to investors and say, hey, look, you're going to invest in SBP and a rebuilding in a community after an event. Invested in this platform. Why? Well, we're going to unlock, 5 to 1. Every dollar you provide is going to give us a really nice return or shield kind of those investor returns. And so that's attractive in itself. Secondly, there is a revenue recurring model here. And Reese, I don't know if you mentioned this at all, but what's worth noting is, so today states pay based off Xactimate. You all know what Xactimate is. What we're going to do is, by scaling this really at wide enough and large enough, we're going to be able to negotiate off scale. So our envision, and when we pro forma this out, we thought we could negotiate it at Xactimate less 20%. Now, as I talk to some, subcontractors or general contractors that work in the disaster recovery space, they're going and holding their subcontractors to 40% off Xactimate. So there is there is precedent here that says that this is possible, but in our ability to negotiate scale, the state will reimburse SBP as the program administrator at that full Xactimate price. Let's call it $30,000. But if we can hold our contractors to an Xactimate less 20%, the actual cost of that repair is only $24,000. So there's actually a $6,000 gap that can be used to fund admin, interest expense, et cetera. So hopefully that helps show you that there is a revenue option. Now I'll leave make one last comment here, because again, this is an important one. The HUD has not specifically stated that they wouldn't consider reimbursing for interest expense of this type in the future. They kind of left an open-ended comment within their response back to SBP's letter of clarification.
Thank you, Keith. The short answer is we're paying the interest expense, right, from the
Oh, thank
profit
you.
generated, generated through the fund's activity. Laura, your second question, does paying off the RAF loan with Restore LA monies improve the homeowner's credit score? I don't know the answer, but somebody else asked me that in just the last few days, and I really want to go explore it with Credit Human because I think there's a good opportunity
I think it
for
would.
us to use this as a transaction that helps level the client up from a credit perspective. And so I'm glad you bring it up. I've heard the feedback elsewhere. I think it's a terrific idea and one that I need to bear down on a little. So Keith and I will do that. And then I guess, Rachel, Keith might have answered your question. The balloon payment is we're leaving up to 3 years for the state government to actually run its due course and pay us back. So we're not holding the homeowner accountable. We'll grant extensions if the state keeps delaying it. We think, though, that the state's going to reimburse it as soon as they possibly can because they're highly incented to do so. And hopefully we'll never have to call on that. But the balloon payment is just all of the money will come from HUD to the client at once, reimbursed all at the same time. All right. What other questions are there? Because I promised people lunchtime and Alicia looks hungry. All right, then I've got some questions for you. Does anybody know or have on them $10 million? No, Laura looked like she was going to check her pockets for a second there. Hey, I'm really thankful that you all would spend 39 of your very precious minutes in this way. I'm excited about RAF. I'm pretty close to it. Obviously, Keith and I spend a ton of time talking about it and explaining it to other people. I hope that this has been informative, or at least that you can share in some of our enthusiasm if it was nothing more than cryptic and confusing. I do think that this is pretty cutting edge stuff. And one of the many things that differentiates SBP from what you might call competitors in the space. There simply aren't other organizations that are building financial products to tease out whether social impact investment can serve poor people faster. They are not out there. We're it. And so I hope you all feel excited and encouraged by the idea that you're working on a team that's experimenting and tinkering around with things like this. If you have great ideas about who does have $10 million on them, or who you think Keith and I ought to be pitching this to next, I'd love to hear it. You know, my cell and email are in my signature line. I'm super easy to get in touch with, and I'm happy to talk about this stuff anytime. Please share the recording with anyone you'd like. I don't think I said anything untoward or political on this in this whole 41 minute call now. So we probably should share it as widely as possible. Thank you all again for your time. If there are additional questions, send them my way, and I hope you all have a terrific rest of your Thursday.